Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got my little cheat sheet of things to do today, and I don't know why, but sometimes I put a lot more information onto this board than what really applies to what I'm planning to do, because as you can see, I've got all of my red wiggler bins listed here. There's stuff up on that shelf that's not red wigglers, and what's in that bag over there, they're not red wigglers either. Only some of these bins are red wigglers, 5 of them to be exact. And of those 5, only 2 of them, as you can see over here, are on the hit list to get fed today. One of them, the oldest of the bunch, it's the one that sits up on the top shelf in the middle. That one is 141 days of age, and it's not being fed. It was last fed 16 days ago, and what it's currently doing is foraging. And then I've got a couple other bins, my newest ones, the ones that are down on the bottom on the floor. Those are the newest of my red wiggler bins, ages 46 and 27. They were just fed 3 days ago, so they're not due for a feeding. It's the ones right here that are 98 days of age and 68 days of age, and they're actually up here on the right side of my shelving system. The 98-day one is on top, and the 68-day one is right beneath it. It's those 2 bins that I've got to feed today. It's been a week since they were last fed, and I think this is actually indicating already today's feeding factored in. Today would be the 98 days 16th feeding, as well as the 68 days 10th feeding. And the food that I've got for them, as you've already seen here on the table, is just an assortment of different kitchen scraps. You can even see some of the frost that was kind of collecting on this stuff, sitting in the freezer for all this time. This is for both bins, so I'll be splitting this down the middle, giving each one half. And I got a couple other things that we're going to use, such as grit and bedding, but those will come up when we get around to feeding. So let's get these things up on the bench and get to work. Now, the one thing I do remember from when I fed these 2 systems last, there was one of them that had a really deteriorated top cover sheet of paper. Because usually I've got sort of an arrangement here where everything sort of has a little bit of a function. So this top cover, in my mind, is just creating darkness. Because usually what's right beneath that is something that allows light through. Either it's see-through or it's translucent like this, and it's my vapor barrier, basically. Most of my bins on this one, unless I'm in a situation where I'm attempting to dry things off within the bin, most of my systems have something right on top, resting right on the material like that. So there's no lid on the container, but it's pretty much serving the same purpose of trying to prevent excess evaporation. And then, totally optional, a lot of people don't do this, but I kind of like having a place for any of that captured vapor. So basically the water vapor gets captured on the plastic, but then right beneath it is a surface onto which it can drop in and soak in. And it really makes this into a popular spot. To me, it always looks like the paper is just ripped open because they just want up and at the moisture so much that they just pick right through the paper. And I got a feeling that this is the piece of paper that's not going to survive one more feeding. It looks very heavily deteriorated. Last time I was in this bin, as I recall, it was extremely difficult to keep it from tearing. That's pretty cool too. You can see the worms are definitely working this indicator that's just trying to show us where we last fed. The feedings in this container have been going around and around, starting here a few weeks ago. So this was a week ago, was when we fed in this corner here. A week prior to that, it was in this corner. So now we've actually made it through all the corners. And in my younger bins that we fed 3 days ago, we had already completed that circuit going around the entire container. And now we're just getting caught up. So at this point, all my red wigglers will have received at least one feeding in each corner. And now we're just continuing. I kind of like the way it works. So I'm going to keep going with it for a while. In the past, I had always sort of just fed down the middle and didn't pay much attention to where I was feeding. It kind of made it simple. You always knew where to go to check how things were progressing with the previous feeding. But now that I'm moving the target around each time, I'm trying to label it with those markers. And whenever those coffee filters deteriorate to the point where they're not really a solid piece of paper anymore, I'll replace those too. Oh. So Yeah, this piece of paper just cannot even hold up to its own weight anymore. It is a little bit soggy, so it is heavier than just a dry piece of paper would be. But at this point, this is going to become bedding for our food. We're not going to need to use much fresh bedding. Although I do have a little collection of used coffee filters here. We could use one of them in here, and then we'll just salvage the rest of that used paper to set up bedding underneath today's feeding. The material looks so nice and damp right underneath the paper. Just fresh castings deposited all over the top surface. Sometimes it's just little segments, little sections, but here, I don't know, maybe I think it's the plastic. I think it's the recirculating moisture that's going on within the bin that really allows the worms to feel really comfortable cruising the surface. And by doing so, they're just scattering their droppings everywhere. So there's worm castings all over this container. So now when we poke open a new hole to feed today, it's going to give us some visibility into how things are progressing in a fairly old feeding area. One that we've checked in on periodically, but we've always returned all the elements that we could find into here to see how they're going to break down. So 1 week ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, so now we're going back 4 weeks in time. And I thought I already saw a hint of one of the objects that were kind of taking a little bit of time in here. Stuff that would, you would expect it to take a long time, something like a peach pit. I don't know what's going to happen with this thing. It's still hard as a rock. But it'll go back in. It'll probably end up coming out with the worms when the bin reaches its harvest day. Because I don't think it's going to break down in the time it takes for a bin to go from start to finish. These are really taking a long time too. These are just the tips off of a radish. So you cut off the leaves off the top, and a lot of times you cut off this little root end of it. And I've got a feeling, other than those radishes and this pit, I think I saw one other thing. I thought I saw the stem of a banana peel, but it was already so far gone you could barely recognize it. Here we've got some avocado seed, if I'm not mistaken, but it just crumbles. And yeah, no wait, is this it? This is actually the stem of something. I don't even know what it is, but it's still pretty stiff. It's kind of like almost like a piece of wood if you're thinking about the stem of a vegetable. I did notice it, but I don't see it now. It was the stem of a banana peel in here too, and it was really shredded. It was, falling to pieces. So if it comes up, we'll make sure it goes back in there. But at this point, we're kind of mixing 4-week-old feedings, leftovers, with today's fresh feeding. So things will sort of start blending together. So this whole visibility of how old something is, at this point, you really do need to sort of distinguish one item from the other when you're picking through one of these feeding zones, because you've now sort of circled back to where you started. But before we drop in the feeding, let's try to size things up here beyond just how the old feeding components and materials are breaking down and progressing. I think from a moisture perspective in general, considering there's been no fresh feedings added to this corner in a month, things are pretty damp, and I attest that to the plastic coverings, keeping the moisture in. There's little scraps of bedding in here, little chunks of leaves, possibly little pieces of paper too. It's hard to tell one from the other. But there's still stuff like that floating around within this bin. And I actually took a little time last week. We did visit in on the oldest bin that is foraging. Even though we didn't feed it, we did go in there and we did pluck out a lot of those little leftover chunks of bedding type materials, whether they were leaves or paper, I don't know, probably mostly paper. And we brought those over and we included in the feeding of this bin and the other bin we're going to feed. But I didn't want to make a habit out of that. At this point, if there's still stuff like this lingering in that bin, after 18 days, after 16 days of that bin not receiving any fresh food, I would imagine that they're going to turn their attention to even those scraps of bedding type materials too, and break those down too once they've depleted all the more easy to eat type food items in there. So, I don't think we need nearly this much space. I kind of just started digging and Forgot that we're here to feed, so let's do that. Instead of goofing around and chit-chatting, let's proceed to the task at hand. So in goes this nice piece of recycled cover paper. I've got a new one here. It's all set to go. It's the perfect size to go in here. And we can even play puzzles next time we check in on the bin. Should be a piece of cake if everyone in the audience is Hungarian, because it's Hungarian newspaper. So, on to the feeding. I can still see chunks of ice in here. It's kind of cool down here in my basement. It's winter time. So the temperature down here lately has been kind of in the neighborhood of, I'd say, how much? 60? Sometimes on a really, really cold winter, when it's really windy outside, the temperature down here does drop around 50, but that's the lowest I remember ever seeing it. So it's a pretty good temperature for the worm composting. I think some of the more tropical breeds of worms that I have in my wormery, I think like the African night crawlers, they tend to operate a little bit more actively, a little bit more efficiently in warmer temperatures, because I think they come from a warmer climate originally. So in this kind of cool temperatures, I think I see my African night crawlers, maybe even my European night crawlers, slow down a little bit. But these red wiggler bins seem to do quite nicely all year round. I've got crushed eggshell here that I'm going to use as grit. The grit just helps the worms digest their food. What else do we have in here? It's a half of an apple, or a quarter of an apple, or thereabouts. So that's a pretty nice feeding. Okay, so now that we've taken care of business, we're just going to cover up the feeding. Not too much. Just enough to sort of level off that feeding area with the rest of the bin, if everything were level. And let's bring back that feeding zone indicator to remind us where we last fed. Because things here on the surface start to really, look alike. Very much so, as a matter of fact, when you just take pretty much finished castings to cover everything up. I'm just curious, though. I wonder how things are doing in the other corners. So like last week's feeding, for example, would probably be where we'd find a good number of worms hanging out, taking advantage of the food. And I think I could see some leftover food bits in here, too. Bedding and food. So not surprising to see a good number of worms in there, as well as a good degree of moisture. That's what you would kind of expect to see, because all that frozen food that they get, all the moisture kicking out of it as it breaks down, all gets released into the bin. I don't add water to any of my bins. I just try to prevent moisture from being lost through evaporation by covering with plastic. So even though I don't add water, I've definitely got good moisture content. I would almost say that it's even more damp than it needs to be, but I like to keep it that way because it does seem to promote a lot of activity within the bin. So this is going back 2 feedings where the material definitely has had a greater amount of time to really break down nicely, making it even more tempting for the worms. So as much as you would think that the most recent feedings would be the most hot item, I think it's the feedings that go back a little even further that are probably the most tempting for the worms, because it's the stuff that has decomposed the most already and deteriorated, making it really easy for them to take advantage of and consume it. So I think I felt a pit in there too. I've got all kinds of peach pits and plum pits in a lot of my feeding zones of a lot of my bins. And it's something that you would have normally never found in my bins in the past, but for whatever reason I figured I'd just give it a try. So they're going to kind of go through the cycle, but chances are they're going to outlive the bin and end up getting moved into a new bin. So I think the breakdown of an object like that would probably require multiple life cycles of a bin, because my bins usually go maybe 150 days or so. So with these bins, approaching the age of 100 days, I would be steering more towards feeding with bedding type materials that I know are going to break down pretty thoroughly. Paper, leaves, I don't know. If I use leaves, I feel like I'm going to end up with a whole bunch of sticks and stems in my compost. And it's been some time since I've added any leaves to this bin. And you still see traces of leaf stems, But they are breaking down quite nicely, and they're whittling down in time. The diameter seems to get reduced. They're all very thin and very breakable. And that's exactly what I want to have happen, because those always seem to be the last to go. You would think that you would use leaves and that the worms would just gobble it all up, but it does seem like they take time just because of the stems of the leaves that need to get broken down too. And they're almost like little chunks of wood, right? So not surprising that they would take some time to break down. Okay, I think we're done here. Let's just see if we can remove these worms from my glove so they don't end up on the floor or somewhere dangerous. Very nice bin. At about 100 days old, like I said earlier, it's 98 days, so it's just a couple days away from reaching its 100-day birthday. It's usually at this stage, you know, depending on how I'm doing as far as space is concerned. If I'm in a larger bin like this one, sometimes it'll be able to continue on before I start to feel like I'm getting crowded out of space in the bin. Oh, I almost forgot. We wanted to include a replacement covering. I don't know why, I just feel rather than placing the plastic coverings right onto the compost, I'd rather just like have this sort of landing pad for that moisture right beneath it to make it as like a little spa area for the worms to be able to hang out on. And it's also kind of like a little welcoming party each time I come into the bin. All the worms are hanging out right there on top. So I totally lost track of what I was talking about. Something about 98 days. Yeah, okay. The bin's at that age now where I would definitely consider transitioning it out of its normal sort of composting cycle and get it into sort of a prep for being harvested. So, you know, maybe, I don't know, a couple more feedings, and then and, you know, at that same time, taking into consideration that those feedings should be materials that I know are going to break down in a few weeks, as opposed to sitting around for months and months. And then transitioning it out of the everyday composting function that it serves right now, and get it also into that sort of foraging mode where they really start to work down all the little lingering scraps of material in the bin. So I feel like I'm getting close to that point with this bin, but I might go a little bit longer. It is getting heavy. But it's one of my larger size bins, and I think I've got space in it to keep going. And my feedings are not that big either, so I think we'll be visiting in on this one again to feed next time. Let's get the next one out here. Alright, so this is, you know, very similar in size. It's not quite as big though. It's not as wide. It's just as long, it's just as deep, but it's just a little bit narrower. So I don't know how much capacity difference that makes. It's not much, but it is a little different. What the heck is that? Now that's something I never see in any of my bins. That's some sort of a little larva. I don't know of what, but some insect placed its egg either in here or in the leaves that I was using in here. Somehow this little guy, I don't know what he's looking to pupate into or turn into, but I've got some sort of a little insect larva in here, which I don't intend to return into the bin. But you could tell that they didn't like the fact that they were in a moist environment, so they came out here where it was a little bit drier. I wonder if it's something that might have even crawled in from outside. Like outside the bin, you know, I don't have tons of bugs in my house. That's why it makes me wonder if it could have just come in with, I don't know, with leaves or something from outside. So it's a little bit of a mystery, but something I certainly don't see very often. So that was a little unusual. Hopefully not the beginning of some sort of a major problem. Alright, so I have the option of trying to remove any worms I see on here, and I do see one, but I always worry about the little ones that I can't see. So you know what, instead of going crazy trying to pick it off, I'm going to just fold it over a little bit here. Try to keep that worm in a damp, safe spot, semi-dark spot, where they don't feel like they've got to go running off. Here again, we're indicating where we last fed, not only with a coffee filter, a little bit better shape than the last one we encountered, but this one also has a pile of leaves where we where we last fed also. So kind of double indicating to us where we last fed. And you know, it's possible that that little guy just took a ride with those leaves. So those leaves look pretty fresh. I don't think they've been around very long. But then again, sitting out on the surface like that, those leaves don't have much of a chance of breaking down. So at some point I've been telling myself I'm going to just eventually sink those down into the feeding area and use them as bedding. They'll serve a better purpose there, and they'll also have a much better chance of breaking down. Looks like we're kind of in the same boat here with this piece of paper. I think we're going to do the same here. Maybe we'll just combine this with one coffee filter when we're feeding, and that should make for a nice portion of bedding to go with the food. And it'll actually be a very generous portion of bedding, because if we decide to also include those leaves as bedding, it'll be even more. And this is a slightly younger bin. That's the reason I'm still comfortable using stuff like fresh leaves that have these huge sticks and stems. And I just don't want to end up having a bin that could really start getting steered towards harvest and then still not be ready because it's just littered with stuff like this. So this stuff's definitely going to get sunken down into the bed and get fed with the rest of the bedding and food that they're getting today. So we could do the same as we did before. We'll just go picking down into where we're going to feed. At this point, it will have been, yeah, I remember now. It will have been the same thing, you know, 4 feedings ago, assuming that each week is about a week between. Last week it was 7, 14, 21, 28 days, close to a month going back here. And yeah, I see them. I see little flying insects, and I believe that that's kind of like 2 flying insects connected by the tail. So that's not just flying insects, but flying insects mating. Yeah. So, you know, I could see how that might put some people off, you know. Flying insects, larvae, unknown insects in the house, in the bin. Well, you know, they definitely tend to stay in their bin, you know. It's not like they're invading the house. In fact, if it wasn't for these bins, I don't think there'd be any insects down here in the basement. But it's kind of one of the minor hazards of doing this, and it's an acceptable one too, I think, because they don't leave the bins. Kind of like the worms too. Some people get bugged out by just the very concept of there being worms in the house. But it's like, what's there to worry about? If one of these little guys creeps out of the bin, it's, you know, it's not a very good chance that they're going to get any further than a couple feet before they just dry out and end up, you know, meeting their end right there within a foot or two of their nice, cozy, damp home. But if they were stupid enough to venture out like that, then they get the Darwin Award, and that's it for them. Let the smarter ones reproduce. Let the dumb ones kill themselves off. Nah, it's kind of cruel. But that is kind of the way it works, right? The material in here, nice and damp, but also, you know, not muddy. So not pooling up on the bottom, no puddles or anything. And not even so damp or muddy that it's sticking to my glove. So it's very damp, but it's the kind of dampness I appreciated in my worm bins, if you want to put it that way. The type of dampness that I know is going to promote a lot of activity in the bin. Worms are going to feel really comfortable. And I think I'll have time later to allow this stuff to air out and dry off if I have to. But for now, I think we're in perfect balance from a moisture perspective. Let's start bringing in, or returning, this piece of paper that we were covering up with. I think I'll have to go find another piece over there. I think I see a piece of newspaper that I can use for this to cover up with at the end. Okay, now, same as before, since we've just used a whole bunch of bedding, I'm going to limit myself to using only one of these coffee filters. I had thought about using 2 of them in here, but I think we're just going to go with 1. So we'll see how much of this we can stack into this coffee filter, and the rest will just go right in there on top of that recycled newspaper. This banana peel is probably going to be pretty popular. Actually, the banana peels do take a little time, so It's all this real green leafy stuff. This is the stuff that's going to go 1, 2, 3. There'll be no sign of that in a week's time, I'm sure. So it's all these other objects that take a little bit longer to get broken down, but the worms do away with all of it in time. It's just kind of having a sense of how long certain things do take, so that in a more mature bin, maybe you don't use things that are going to require a lot of time to break down. Otherwise, you're just going to be fishing it out of your compost. Be careful with that eggshell dust. If you use it and it gets airborne, don't breathe it in. It's not good for you. So that part of the avocado seed broke apart very readily. This one is ready to break apart too, but I like keeping them intact so we can see how the worms do away with it. I know I can crush it in my hands if I wanted to, but I'd rather see how the worms do away with it. And you can see they're working this mango down too, gradually. I'm just a little bit surprised at how long it's taking, because usually the meaty portion of the the avocado is gobbled right up, but for whatever reason they're not really doing anything with this one. And the shell is getting pretty broken down and soft, but for whatever reason that avocado is just not making much progress, and I don't know why. Hopefully it changes soon. We see a little bit more activity going on there. So like we said, let's see if we can get a little bit more activity going on with these chunks of leaves. I think these leaves were originally used to indicate where the feeding was over here, and then we moved it over here. Might even go back as far as over here. Seemed like a good idea to sort of double mark the feeding area, but there's certainly no need to. We've got our good old coffee filter to show us where we last fed. So we're going to get this leafy type bedding material into a spot where we think it's going to probably get a lot more attention and start breaking down finally, because it's just been in here for such a long time. So it's a banana stem. Stick it down in there. That's also, I guess, 28 days of composting activity. Let's get this thing back the way we found it, except the feeding zone indicator goes where we last fed, not where we found it. The other day I actually put the feeding zone indicator back where I found it rather than over the freshly added food. I'm so glad, you know, there's people out there looking out for me. They're like, hey. So within a couple hours I was able to come right back down here and correct the matter, because I'm sharing these videos and people are providing me with their input and their feedback, and I think that's just so awesome. I think we'll just take a quick peek at how these older feeding zones and stuff is coming along before we pack up here and call it a day. This really stumpy worm, I don't know why. I think we ran into him or her or both last time, and we even noted, hey, what a stocky worm. And I don't know why of all these worms there's one that looks like that. Is that the queen worm? I don't think that exists. But yeah, that's just an interesting observation, and it seems like it's hard to imagine picking one particular worm out of your bin, but I would almost bet a nickel that that was the same worm that I encountered during a recent feeding and made note of it. And it just seems like, you know, what's the chance of that? All right, so I think like we saw before, the most recent feeding is pretty popular. And after a week's time, the food in there is starting to break down nicely and attracting worms. But I got a feeling over here, these feedings that are like two feedings old, maybe 2 weeks old, it's probably where we're going to find even more action. But there I go, proving myself wrong again. So, okay, maybe it's just going down a little bit deeper and finding where the action really is. Down here, there is a little jumble of worms. So I guess they've zeroed in on where the good stuff is. I just hadn't gotten to it yet. So there's definitely pockets of lingering food in here that they're still chewing on. There's even, you know, scraps of the paper that the food was introduced in, probably a coffee filter, but it's so hard to tell anymore. So it's all getting worked down really nicely, and the moisture level's really nice. I'm sure the worms appreciate it. And I'm trying to figure out what the heck this is. What an unusual looking little object. I wonder if it's maybe sweet potato? I don't want to crush it, you know. I like being able to check in on an object even if I can't identify it. I could just say, oh yeah, that's that orange thing I saw last week. It's still not done yet, or whatever the case may be. Because, you know, regardless of whether or not we can identify it, sometimes it is just interesting to track the progress of certain food items to see how they're breaking down. Well, we got one other pocket we can check before we call it a day. Why not? Let's go back 3 weeks in time to see how things are progressing. So I guess whatever the residual number of worms in any given feeding area could probably be influenced most greatly by what type of food you had placed in there. If it was watermelon, there'd be no trace of it in days and the worms would all be gone. But if we find lots of worms in certain feeding areas, chances are that it's a material that's taking a little longer to break down, but it's breaking down nicely, so they're enjoying it. This one's breaking down really nicely too. But that just gives you a quick little rough illustration of, you know, a banana stem. 3 weeks of breakdown, roughly speaking. You never know, because I stir things around pretty good, but I think with this pocket feeding, I've been a little bit more disciplined in not doing that, trying to let things remain where they were when they were originally placed in the bin, so we can kind of get that sense of how much time has passed. So I've been doing my best not to stir things around as much as I usually do. All right, let's find ourselves a little piece of paper that we can cover up with, and then we can get this whole thing buttoned up. At first I thought I would just take a piece of this newspaper, this old yellow newspaper. Look how old this thing is, New York Times. 2 more months, this thing's going to be a 10-year-old piece of paper. This is what a piece of newsprint would look like after 10 years of aging. It's very, very yellowish already, and perhaps a little bit more brittle than fresh paper, but I'm holding up pretty good. So at some point soon it will get fed to the worms. But you know what? Instead of using paper, I had this idea. I've got all this beach towel here, and I've already gone so far as to finally start testing out how the worms do with fabrics. So I've got a piece of this beach towel in one of my younger bins, but I figured, you know what? This bin is still young enough. I bet there's still time for them to, I don't know, I really don't know, but I've got this hunch that if we put this in here as the top cover and it starts to get really damp, I think it's going to become just as popular a spot as paper for the worms to hang out on. But I really don't know, so I'm curious to see how it progresses. So this is a first for me, other than that other piece of the towel that's over in one of my younger bins, which is actually buried really down deep, and you know, once in a while I see the very end of it. And it's only been in there for a few weeks, so I wouldn't even expect it to be very broken down yet. But we don't really get a good look at it. I think by being out here on the surface, that's going to give us a much better view of how things are progressing with it as well. So that's an interesting new thing to try here. Definitely interested in seeing how that progresses. I know there was a worm on here. Still there. They're still pretty chill. And at this point, we're just restoring things for the most part for them, except for this really dry piece of towel in here. I think this towel is going to suck up a fair bit of the moisture in the bin, but I don't think it's going to be a dire situation. It's got a nice moisture level, this bin, but I am curious to see how it looks in a week when, you know, that one fairly large dry object has a chance to absorb some of the moisture in the bin. I don't know about you, but I'm definitely curious to see how things progress with that towel. Ugh. These flying insects, I hate them. I don't know why, but and they're usually not in great numbers either, so I don't even know why I bother. But I don't know. Sometimes you just wish you had bins that had nothing but worms in them. But you got to also accept the fact that chances are your worms have a lot of little neighbors in there helping them out too. So just something occurred to me about that little chubby worm that we noticed in there. And when we checked the old feeding zone, the one that we thought we'd seen before, I got to keep reminding myself, and it's right here. The reminder is right here on the side of the container, that this is not only red wigglers, but these are the worms that I received in a trade where the person that I was getting them, they figured it was a combination of red wigglers and ENCs, but since I know where that person purchased these worms. I can also probably safely assume that there's probably some Indian blues mixed in here as well. So the bottom line is I don't know what the heck is living in this thing. It could be just about anything. So that's part of what makes it interesting. All right, everyone, I'm going to put this thing away, and you can see I already got a little head start on getting cleaned up. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.